Japan during the Second World War. Chapter 1: The Country Before the War. Long before the Second World War reached its final and most destructive years, Japan was already a nation undergoing rapid change. Stretching across a chain of mountainous islands in the western Pacific Ocean, the country combined ancient traditions with modern industry in a way that was unusual for its time. The four largest islands, Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku, were home to most of the population, while thousands of smaller islands dotted the surrounding seas. Narrow coastal plains held the largest cities, while forests and steep mountains covered much of the interior. Rivers were generally short but important, providing water for farming and helping connect nearby communities. By the late 1930s, Japan was home to more than 70 million people. The great majority lived on the home islands, although the empire also governed territories beyond them, including Korea, Taiwan, southern Sakhalin, and several Pacific islands. Japanese cities had grown rapidly during the previous decades. Tokyo, rebuilt after the devastating Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, had once again become one of the world's largest cities. Osaka stood as a major industrial center, while Yokohama served as an important port. Kyoto preserved many historic temples and traditions, and cities such as Nagoya, Kobe, Hiroshima, and Fukuoka each played important roles in manufacturing, shipping, education, or regional administration. Although modern buildings increasingly appeared in urban centers, much of Japan still looked familiar to earlier generations. Wooden houses lined quiet streets, tiled roofs overlooked narrow lanes, and small neighborhood shops supplied daily necessities. In rural villages, farmhouses stood among rice paddies that changed appearance with each season. Spring brought fresh green shoots, summer filled the fields with growing rice, autumn offered the harvest, and winter allowed farmers to repair tools and prepare for another cycle. Agriculture remained essential to everyday life despite the country's growing industries. Rice was the staple crop and occupied a central place in both farming and culture. Farmers also grew barley, wheat, sweet potatoes, vegetables, soybeans, and fruit where conditions allowed. Fishing was equally important. Surrounded by productive coastal waters, Japan relied heavily on seafood. Fishing boats departed before sunrise, supplying markets with tuna, sardines, mackerel, squid, shellfish, and countless other varieties that became part of daily meals across the country. Industry expanded steadily during the early 20th century. Textile mills employed large numbers of workers, especially women, producing silk and cotton for domestic use and export. Heavy industries also developed quickly. Steel mills, shipyards, engineering works, chemical plants, and machinery factories supported both civilian needs and an increasingly ambitious military establishment. Many of these industries clustered around major ports, where imported raw materials could be unloaded and finished products shipped onward. Japan possessed few natural resources compared with other industrial powers. Coal could be mined domestically, particularly on Kyushu and Hokkaido, but supplies of oil, iron ore, rubber, and many strategic materials depended heavily on imports. This reliance on overseas trade would later become one of the country's greatest strategic concerns. Ships arriving from Southeast Asia, the Americas, and elsewhere carried materials that kept factories operating and cities supplied. The railway network connected much of the country. Steam locomotives carried passengers between cities and transported coal, food, manufactured goods, and mail across the islands. Railway stations served as busy meeting places where commuters, students, soldiers, merchants, and travelers passed one another throughout the day. Electric tramways operated in many larger cities, while buses gradually expanded into areas not served by rail. Automobiles remained relatively uncommon for private families, and bicycles provided an affordable means of transport for workers, students, shopkeepers, and farmers alike. Education occupied an important place in Japanese society. Nearly all children attended primary school, where they learned reading, writing, mathematics, geography, history, and moral education. Teachers encouraged discipline, punctuality, and respect for authority. School uniforms became common, especially in urban areas, helping create a sense of shared identity among students. Beyond primary education, some continued into secondary schools or technical colleges, while universities educated future engineers, doctors, teachers, civil servants, and military officers. Religion reflected a blend of traditions rather than strict divisions. Shinto shrines stood throughout towns and villages, honoring local spirits and national traditions. Buddhist temples offered places for worship, funerals, and community gatherings. Many families observed customs associated with both religions, visiting shrines during one season and temples during another. Festivals remained important occasions, bringing neighborhoods together through music, lanterns, food stalls, and traditional performances. The radio had become an increasingly familiar companion in many homes. Families gathered during the evening to hear music, educational programs, weather forecasts, and government announcements. Newspapers circulated widely, delivering national and international news alongside sports, serialized stories, advertisements, and practical advice. Although literacy rates were high, not every household could afford multiple newspapers, so copies were often shared among neighbors or discussed at local cafes and workplaces. Meals reflected both regional traditions and seasonal availability. Rice formed the center of most dinners, accompanied by miso soup, pickled vegetables, fish, tofu, or small portions of meat where affordable. Breakfast frequently included rice, soup, and grilled fish, while lunches varied according to occupation. Workers might carry simple packed meals, known as bento, containing rice, vegetables, and preserved foods. In cities, small restaurants served noodles, tempura, or other familiar dishes to office workers and laborers seeking an inexpensive meal. Family life generally followed well-established routines. Many households included several generations living together. Grandparents helped care for children, while parents worked inside or outside the home depending on the family's circumstances. In rural areas, everyone often contributed to farming tasks according to age and ability. Children gathered firewood, fed animals, or helped with planting and harvesting before or after school. In cities, fathers commonly worked long hours in offices, factories, or workshops, while mothers managed household budgets, cooking, laundry, and childcare. Leisure time remained modest but meaningful. Baseball had become remarkably popular, attracting enthusiastic crowds. Traditional theater forms such as kabuki continued alongside modern cinema, while cafes offered places for conversation over tea or coffee. Public baths provided opportunities not only for washing but also for social interaction, with neighbors exchanging news after the day's work had ended. By the late 1930s, however, many aspects of everyday life had already begun to change. Japan had not suddenly entered a state of war in December 1941, as is sometimes remembered outside the country. Military conflict had already become part of national life several years earlier. The fighting in China, which expanded dramatically in 1937 following the Marco Polo Bridge incident, increasingly influenced politics, industry, education, and public discussion. Although daily routines still appeared familiar on the surface, many families had already experienced the departure of sons, brothers, or fathers into military service. Little by little, the boundary between ordinary civilian life and national mobilization became less distinct. What had once seemed temporary gradually became permanent. Newspapers devoted increasing attention to military successes overseas. Schools placed greater emphasis on patriotism and physical fitness. Factories accepted more government direction, while officials encouraged citizens to conserve resources and support national objectives. Many people hoped stability would eventually return. Yet by the close of the 1930s, Japan stood on a path that would draw the country into a conflict far larger than most ordinary citizens could imagine. Chapter 2: The Road to War. Japan's path toward the wider Second World War unfolded gradually rather than through a single dramatic decision. During the early decades of the 20th century, the country had already established itself as a major regional power. Victories in earlier conflicts, including the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, strengthened confidence among military leaders and encouraged ambitions beyond the home islands. At the same time, the global economic difficulties of the 1930s shaped domestic politics. The Great Depression affected international trade, reducing demand for exports and creating uncertainty for businesses and workers alike. Rural communities suffered particularly hard as silk prices collapsed, reducing the income of farming families who depended upon sericulture. Some households struggled to repay debts or purchase essential goods. These hardships encouraged support for leaders who promised national strength, economic security, and greater self-sufficiency. The military gradually acquired greater influence over government policy. Army and Navy officers argued that Japan required secure access to raw materials in order to survive as an industrial nation. They believed dependence upon imported oil, iron ore, and rubber left the country vulnerable to foreign pressure. Expansion into parts of East Asia, they argued, would provide resources while also protecting Japan from perceived threats. The occupation of Manchuria in 1931 marked an important turning point. Although the operation drew criticism from abroad, it strengthened the position of military leaders at home. The civilian government increasingly found it difficult to restrain the armed forces, whose influence continued to expand throughout the decade. For ordinary people, these political developments often appeared indirectly rather than dramatically. Newspapers described military events in optimistic language. Radio broadcasts praised national achievements. Schools introduced additional patriotic ceremonies and lessons that emphasized duty, sacrifice, and loyalty to the emperor. Children learned songs celebrating the nation, while textbooks increasingly reflected official priorities. In many towns, young men expected that military service would eventually become part of adult life. Conscription had existed for many years, but as conflict expanded in China, larger numbers of reservists received orders to report for duty. Railway stations witnessed emotional but orderly departures as families gathered to say farewell. Shopkeepers displayed small national flags, neighbors offered encouragement, and local associations organized ceremonies for departing soldiers. Despite these changes, everyday life continued in remarkably familiar ways. Factories remained busy, schools stayed open, markets sold seasonal produce, and festivals were still celebrated where conditions allowed. Yet beneath this appearance of normality, the country was preparing itself for a future that would demand increasing sacrifices from nearly every household. Chapter 3: The Outbreak of War. By the autumn of 1941, Japan faced growing diplomatic and economic pressure. Relations with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands had deteriorated sharply. Restrictions on the export of oil and other strategic materials threatened industries, transport, and military operations alike. Negotiations continued, but confidence that a peaceful settlement could be reached steadily diminished. For most civilians, international diplomacy remained distant. They learned of developments primarily through newspapers and radio broadcasts, both of which operated under increasing government supervision. Rumors circulated in workplaces and neighborhoods, but few people knew exactly what decisions were being made behind closed doors. Everything changed during the early days of December 1941. On the 8th of December, according to Japanese time, the government announced that the nation had entered war against the United States and the British Empire. News spread rapidly through radio broadcasts, newspaper extras, factory loudspeakers, schools, and government offices. Many people first heard the announcement while preparing breakfast or beginning their day's work. The attack on Pearl Harbor had taken place thousands of kilometers away, yet its consequences reached almost every household with remarkable speed. Public ceremonies were organized, patriotic speeches became more frequent, and newspapers reported early military successes across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. In the opening months of the conflict, Japanese forces advanced rapidly through Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. Reports of these victories were presented as evidence that the nation had entered a new era of strength and opportunity. For ordinary citizens, however, daily routines also began to change in quieter ways. Government offices expanded systems of rationing and economic control. Factories shifted further toward military production. Raw materials became more carefully allocated, and households were encouraged to avoid unnecessary consumption. Campaigns promoted thrift, recycling, and careful use of clothing, paper, metal, and fuel. Schools adjusted their schedules to include additional physical training, civil preparedness, and practical work supporting the national war effort. Children collected scrap materials, participated in organized exercises, and learned emergency procedures. Teachers increasingly balanced traditional lessons with wartime responsibilities expected by the government. Railways grew busier as soldiers, equipment, and supplies moved across the country. Passenger services continued, but military transport often received priority. Stations filled with uniforms alongside ordinary travelers carrying shopping baskets, briefcases, or parcels wrapped in cloth. The familiar rhythm of steam locomotives remained unchanged, yet the purpose of many journeys had altered. In neighborhoods across Japan, air raid precautions gradually became part of ordinary life. Although enemy bombers would not threaten the home islands immediately, local authorities encouraged communities to prepare. Firefighting equipment was organized, blackout measures introduced, and volunteer groups trained for possible emergencies. Families learned where shelters were located and how to respond should warning sirens ever sound. As 1941 came to an end, many citizens believed the war might be decided quickly. Early victories seemed to confirm official optimism, and daily life, while increasingly regulated, still retained much of its familiar rhythm. Yet beneath this confidence, the demands placed upon society were steadily increasing. The years ahead would reshape nearly every aspect of life in Japan, from the food placed on the family table to the work performed in factories, schools, and homes. Chapter 4: Military events that changed daily life. During the first months of the Pacific War, military news arriving in Japan was almost entirely positive. Newspapers printed large headlines announcing victories, while radio broadcasts described Japanese forces advancing across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Hong Kong fell in December 1941. Singapore surrendered in February 1942 after a campaign that surprised many observers around the world. The Dutch East Indies, rich in oil, soon came under Japanese control, and the Philippines were gradually occupied after months of fighting. For many civilians, these reports seemed to confirm what government leaders had promised. Japan now possessed access to territories that could provide oil, rubber, rice, metals, and many other resources that had become increasingly difficult to obtain through international trade. Although the war had expanded dramatically, many people believed these early successes might shorten the conflict rather than prolong it. Life at home, however, was already becoming more organized around wartime priorities. Ministries in Tokyo issued new regulations governing industry, transportation, and the distribution of materials. Local officials carefully explained these rules through neighborhood associations, schools, workplaces, and public meetings. Citizens became accustomed to notices appearing on bulletin boards, reminding them of conservation measures or changes in local regulations. The government encouraged communities to work together through neighborhood organizations known as tonrigumi. These groups had existed in various forms before the war, but their responsibilities steadily expanded. Usually consisting of a small number of nearby households, they helped distribute official information, organized fire prevention equipment, coordinated civil defense exercises, and assisted with rationing. Members also collected donations for the war effort, organized community cleaning days, and checked that blackout regulations were being followed. These neighborhood associations became one of the most familiar features of wartime life. For many families, government policy was experienced not through distant ministries but through conversations with neighbors who had accepted volunteer or administrative roles within the local group. Meetings often took place in modest community buildings or private homes, where practical matters such as food distribution, emergency drills, and household responsibilities could be discussed. Although military victories filled newspaper headlines during 1942, the wider course of the war was beginning to change. In June of that year, the Battle of Midway marked a significant turning point. Several Japanese aircraft carriers were lost, along with many experienced naval aviators whose skills could not easily be replaced. At the time, the Japanese public learned little about the scale of the defeat. Official reports remained carefully controlled, emphasizing courage while providing only limited information about setbacks. This pattern became increasingly common as the war continued. During the early victories, newspapers readily published accounts of successful operations. As conditions worsened, military censorship became stricter. Defeats were often reported only briefly, delayed, or omitted altogether. Many civilians therefore experienced the changing fortunes of the war indirectly rather than through detailed news reports. Instead, they noticed change through everyday life. Goods became harder to find. Trains became more crowded. Letters from relatives arrived less frequently. Young men disappeared from schools, offices, and workshops as military service expanded. Factory production increasingly replaced consumer goods with military equipment. By late 1942 and throughout 1943, the demands of total war reached deeper into nearly every household. The campaign on Guadalcanal required enormous quantities of ships, aircraft, fuel, ammunition, and trained personnel. Although the fighting occurred thousands of kilometers away, Japanese factories worked longer hours to replace lost equipment. Shipyards launched new vessels while engineering works produced engines, tools, and machinery at an ever faster pace. Workers frequently found themselves adapting to changing schedules. Overtime became common in industries considered essential to the war effort. Some factories introduced additional shifts so that machinery could operate almost continuously. Employees often traveled before dawn or returned home late in the evening, especially in industrial cities such as Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama. As military losses increased, labor shortages became more noticeable. Many experienced workers had entered military service, leaving factories to train younger employees or transfer workers from other occupations. Women assumed larger roles in manufacturing, transportation, agriculture, and administrative work. Although traditional expectations about family life remained influential, wartime necessity gradually expanded opportunities for women to perform work previously carried out mainly by men. Throughout 1943, Japan's merchant shipping also suffered increasing losses. Allied submarines and aircraft attacked cargo vessels carrying oil, food, raw materials, and manufactured goods across the Pacific and East Asia. Each ship that failed to reach its destination represented more than a military statistic. It meant fewer supplies reaching factories, fewer imported materials arriving at ports, and increasing pressure on civilian distribution systems. These changes unfolded slowly rather than suddenly. A shop might receive fewer deliveries than before. A factory manager might announce that certain materials could no longer be obtained. Families discovered that familiar household items had become difficult to replace. Repair became more important than buying new possessions. Clothing was carefully mended. Shoes were repaired whenever possible. Kitchen utensils remained in use for many years instead of being replaced. By 1944, Allied forces had advanced steadily across the Pacific. American submarines restricted Japanese shipping with increasing effectiveness, while long-range bombing campaigns became possible as Allied aircraft captured islands closer to the Japanese home islands. Until then, many civilians had experienced war mainly through shortages, regulations, and the absence of family members serving overseas. During 1944, the war itself began drawing physically closer. American aircraft first carried out limited attacks against parts of Japan, reminding the population that the home islands were no longer beyond reach. Although these early raids were relatively small, they prompted authorities to intensify civil defense preparations. Air raid drills became more frequent. Schools practiced orderly evacuations. Neighborhood associations inspected emergency equipment. Buckets of water, sand, ladders, and simple firefighting tools were positioned throughout residential districts. Families prepared small bundles containing essential belongings in case evacuation became necessary. Blackout regulations became stricter. At night, windows were carefully covered to reduce visible light. Street lighting was limited. Curtains, shutters, and specially prepared coverings helped conceal homes from aircraft flying overhead. For younger children, these preparations often seemed confusing rather than frightening. Adults attempted to maintain ordinary routines whenever possible, continuing school lessons, work schedules, shopping trips, and religious observances despite the growing uncertainty. The most dramatic changes came during 1945. By then, American B-29 bombers were operating regularly from bases in the Mariana Islands. Their range allowed repeated attacks against Japanese cities, factories, ports, and transportation networks. On the night of 9 to 10 March 1945, Tokyo experienced one of the most destructive air raids in history. Hundreds of bombers dropped large numbers of incendiary bombs across densely populated districts where many homes had been constructed primarily from wood and paper. Fire spread rapidly through entire neighborhoods. Other cities soon experienced similar attacks. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, Toyama. Many industrial and residential areas suffered extensive destruction during the following months. For ordinary civilians, these bombings fundamentally altered daily life. Families who had remained together suddenly found themselves separated. Homes disappeared within a single night. Schools closed temporarily or moved classes elsewhere. Workplaces relocated production when factories were damaged. Many children had already been evacuated from major cities to rural communities, where they stayed with relatives, host families, temples, or schools believed to be safer from bombing. This program expanded considerably during the final year of the war. Transportation also became increasingly difficult. Railway lines required constant repair after air attacks. Bridges were damaged. Fuel shortages reduced available services. Passengers often traveled under crowded conditions while carrying whatever possessions they could manage. Postal deliveries slowed. Telephone communication remained limited. Information moved more slowly, increasing anxiety among families waiting for letters from relatives serving in distant parts of Asia or the Pacific. By the summer of 1945, daily life had become a careful balance between maintaining ordinary routines and responding to repeated emergencies. Many people still rose before sunrise. Meals were still prepared from whatever ingredients could be obtained. Children still attended school where possible. Workers still reported to factories, offices, farms, railway depots, and shipyards. Yet nearly every routine now included the possibility of interruption by an air raid siren. The war had become impossible to separate from ordinary life. Chapter 5: Civilian Life During the War. While military operations unfolded across thousands of kilometers, the experience of most Japanese civilians remained centered on familiar places: the home, the neighborhood, the workplace, the local market, and the school. These ordinary settings changed gradually as wartime regulations expanded, creating a society that became increasingly organized around conservation, discipline, and shared responsibility. One of the first changes many families noticed was the growing number of official instructions governing everyday behavior. Government ministries issued regulations concerning the use of fuel, electricity, clothing, metals, paper, and household goods. These measures were usually communicated through local authorities and neighborhood associations rather than directly from Tokyo. Posters appeared in public buildings encouraging citizens to avoid waste, repair damaged items, and contribute materials for national use. Saving resources became both a practical necessity and a civic expectation. Children collected scrap metal. Families stored used paper. Cooking oil was carefully preserved. Broken tools were repaired instead of replaced. Even small household items could be gathered for recycling if they contained materials considered useful to industry. Electricity remained available in most communities, but households were encouraged to reduce unnecessary consumption. Lights were switched off promptly when rooms became empty. Businesses shortened illuminated advertising. During periods of increased demand or damage to infrastructure, local restrictions sometimes reduced available power. Heating varied according to region. Northern areas such as Hokkaido continued relying on coal and wood during cold winters, while many homes elsewhere used charcoal braziers or traditional heating methods. As fuel supplies became scarcer, families often gathered together in fewer heated rooms to conserve resources. Housing itself changed surprisingly little in appearance despite the many new regulations. Traditional wooden homes still stood throughout towns and villages. Tatami mats covered floors, sliding paper screens divided rooms, and futons were folded away each morning to create living space during the day. What changed was how these homes were used. Storage cupboards increasingly held emergency supplies. Windows required blackout coverings. Buckets for firefighting stood ready near entrances. Some families prepared simple evacuation bags containing clothing, identification papers, and a few personal belongings. Government-issued identity documents became increasingly important. People traveling between districts or relocating for work often carried official papers confirming employment, residence, or other necessary information. Administrative procedures became more detailed as authorities attempted to manage labor, transportation, and food distribution efficiently. Public transport continued operating throughout much of the war despite growing difficulties. Electric trams still moved through city streets. Steam trains continued crossing the countryside. Buses linked smaller communities. Yet services became more crowded and less predictable as fuel shortages and military priorities affected scheduling. Passengers learned to expect delays. Many simply waited patiently on station platforms, knowing that transport remained essential for workers, students, and farmers alike. Shops also adapted to wartime conditions. Store windows became noticeably simpler. Luxury goods largely disappeared. Shelves increasingly displayed practical necessities rather than decorative items. Shopkeepers spent considerable time explaining rationing rules, available supplies, and expected delivery dates. Customers often visited several shops before finding particular items. Despite these inconveniences, neighborhood commerce remained remarkably resilient. Small greengrocers continued selling seasonal vegetables. Fishmongers opened early each morning when supplies permitted. Bakers, tofu makers, rice merchants, and family-owned businesses continued serving their communities with whatever products could be obtained. These familiar routines provided an important sense of continuity even as conditions steadily became more difficult. Chapter 6: Food, Rationing, and the Daily Meal. Among all the changes brought by the war, few affected ordinary families more consistently than the gradual transformation of the daily meal. Food was part of every household's routine, and as the conflict continued, shopping, cooking, and eating required increasing amounts of planning, patience, and adaptability. The changes did not happen all at once. During the early years of the Pacific War, many familiar foods could still be found, although prices rose and certain imported items became less common. As shipping losses increased and harvests came under greater pressure, shortages became a regular feature of everyday life. Japan had long relied on rice as its principal staple food. Before the war, most households considered a bowl of steamed rice to be the center of every main meal. Alongside it might be miso soup, pickled vegetables, grilled fish, tofu, or small portions of meat depending upon the family's income and the season. These meals were generally modest by modern standards, yet they reflected generations of culinary tradition and careful use of local ingredients. As wartime conditions became more demanding, maintaining this familiar pattern grew increasingly difficult. The government introduced a system of food controls intended to distribute essential supplies as fairly as possible while ensuring that the armed forces received priority. Local authorities supervised rationing, and households became accustomed to receiving ration coupons or ration books that entitled them to fixed quantities of particular foods. The exact amounts changed over time and often varied according to age, occupation, health, and local availability. Shopping itself became a more deliberate process than it had been before the war. Instead of simply visiting a market and choosing whatever was available, customers often carried their ration documents together with shopping bags or baskets, knowing that only certain quantities could be purchased. Shopkeepers carefully recorded each transaction, ensuring that allowances were correctly deducted. Supplies sometimes arrived irregularly, meaning that families learned to visit shops early or listen for news of fresh deliveries. Queues became an ordinary part of daily life. People waited patiently outside rice merchants, greengrocers, fish shops, and cooperative stores. Conversations often remained quiet and practical. Neighbors exchanged information about which shops had received vegetables that morning or whether a delivery of cooking oil was expected later in the week. These small discussions helped families make the most of limited opportunities. Rice remained available throughout much of the war, but in steadily smaller quantities. To stretch supplies, many households mixed rice with other grains such as barley or millet. Sweet potatoes also became an increasingly important substitute. Although these changes altered the familiar taste and texture of meals, they allowed precious rice stocks to last longer. Breakfast continued to be a simple meal for many families. A typical morning might begin with a modest bowl of mixed rice and barley, accompanied by miso soup prepared with whatever vegetables were available. Pickled radish or other preserved vegetables often added flavor without requiring fresh ingredients. When fish could be obtained, a small grilled portion might be shared among family members, though such additions became less frequent as the war progressed. Lunch depended greatly upon occupation. Factory workers sometimes carried carefully prepared bento boxes from home. These no longer contained the generous portions of rice that had once been common. Instead, the contents reflected whatever ingredients the household had managed to obtain: barley rice, sweet potatoes, preserved vegetables, soy products, or occasionally a small piece of fish. School children also brought lunches when possible, although some schools organized simple communal meals using supplies allocated through local authorities. Evening meals remained the main opportunity for families to gather together despite increasingly demanding work schedules. Dinner usually centered upon whatever staple food remained available. Miso soup continued to appear regularly because it could be adapted to many different ingredients. A handful of leafy greens, slices of radish, onions, burdock root, or seasonal vegetables could transform a simple broth into a filling dish. Tofu, when available, provided valuable protein without relying upon scarce meat supplies. Fresh fish had traditionally been an important source of nourishment throughout Japan. Coastal communities often continued fishing during the war, but fuel shortages, military requirements, and transportation difficulties made regular distribution increasingly complicated. Inland towns therefore experienced greater variation in supply, and many families learned to preserve fish through drying or salting whenever possible. Meat remained relatively uncommon for much of the population even before the war, so its further reduction represented less of a cultural change than it might have elsewhere. Instead, soybeans and soybean products became increasingly valuable. Tofu, miso, soy sauce, and other familiar foods provided nourishment while making efficient use of domestic agricultural production. sugar became progressively harder to obtain. Sweets that had once delighted children gradually disappeared from shop shelves or became reserved for special occasions. Families adapted by making simple treats from locally available ingredients when circumstances allowed. Fruit, particularly when in season, became an appreciated source of natural sweetness. Coffee, which relied heavily upon imports, became scarce. Many households turned instead to substitute beverages prepared from roasted grains or other locally available ingredients. Tea remained an important part of daily life, although varieties and quality sometimes reflected wartime shortages. A simple pot of green tea still accompanied conversation, welcomed visitors, or concluded an evening meal, preserving a sense of normality amid changing circumstances. Gardens acquired renewed importance. Where space permitted, households cultivated vegetables in small plots behind homes, beside schools, or on unused land within towns. Cabbages, onions, beans, spinach, pumpkins, and sweet potatoes could all contribute to the family table. Even limited harvests reduced dependence upon ration supplies and provided welcome variety throughout the year. Schools, neighborhood organizations, and agricultural officials frequently encouraged these efforts. Practical advice on composting, seed selection, and efficient cultivation appeared in newspapers or community meetings. Children often helped water plants after school or remove weeds during weekends, making food production a shared family activity. The changing seasons remained important guides for cooking. Spring offered fresh greens and early vegetables. Summer brought cucumbers, eggplants, and tomatoes where conditions allowed. Autumn remained the principal harvest season, providing rice, root vegetables, and fruit. Winter encouraged greater reliance upon preserved foods, dried produce, and carefully stored supplies accumulated during previous months. In this way, seasonal rhythms continued despite the disruptions of war. The black market also became an increasingly significant, though officially illegal, feature of food distribution. Not every family relied upon it, and participation varied greatly depending on region and circumstance. Some people exchanged clothing, household goods, or personal possessions for additional food obtained through unofficial channels. Farmers occasionally traded directly with urban relatives or trusted acquaintances, bypassing official distribution systems. Such arrangements were often discreet, reflecting both practical necessity and awareness of government regulations. For many city residents, visits to relatives in the countryside became especially valuable. A journey to a farming district might provide opportunities to exchange manufactured goods for rice, vegetables, or preserved foods. These personal relationships sometimes helped families supplement official rations without relying entirely upon commercial markets. Cooking itself became an exercise in careful economy. Nothing useful was wasted. Vegetable peelings found their way into soups. Leftover rice became porridge the following morning. Small amounts of seasoning were used thoughtfully to add flavor without unnecessary expense. Experienced home cooks developed considerable skill in preparing satisfying meals from surprisingly limited ingredients, drawing upon traditions of frugality that had long existed in Japanese cuisine. Children adapted alongside adults. Many grew up accepting that favorite foods might not always be available. They learned patience while standing beside parents in shop queues and became accustomed to meals that changed according to supply rather than preference. Teachers often reinforced the importance of avoiding waste, encouraging pupils to finish every portion placed before them. Although shortages became increasingly severe during the final years of the war, the daily meal remained about more than nourishment alone. Families still gathered around low tables whenever work schedules allowed. Hands were placed together briefly before eating in a familiar expression of gratitude. Conversations continued, sometimes about school, sometimes about work, and sometimes simply about the weather or the coming harvest. These ordinary moments offered a reassuring sense of routine. Even as supplies diminished and recipes changed, the shared meal continued to provide structure to the day and a quiet reminder of home. By 1945, however, worsening transportation difficulties, damaged farmland, and the destruction caused by repeated air raids meant that food shortages reached levels far more serious than earlier in the war. Many households found it increasingly difficult to obtain even their official ration allowances. People spent more time searching for supplies, cultivating gardens, or traveling to rural districts in hope of bringing home a few additional vegetables or grains. Yet throughout these difficult years, countless families continued to do what they had always done. They adjusted recipes, shared what they had, avoided waste wherever possible, and relied upon careful planning rather than abundance. The wartime table looked very different from that of the late 1930s, but it remained a place where ordinary life, however changed, continued from one day to the next. Chapter 7: Transport, Work, and Industry. Keeping a country functioning during wartime required far more than armies and weapons. Every day, trains carried workers to factories, fishing boats left their harbors before dawn, postal employees sorted thousands of letters, and farmers tended fields that would provide the next harvest. In Japan, these ordinary activities became increasingly shaped by the demands of war, yet they never entirely disappeared. Even during the most difficult years, millions of people continued to work, travel, and maintain the systems upon which daily life depended. Before the war, Japan had developed one of the most extensive railway networks in Asia. Railways connected major cities, industrial centers, ports, and many rural communities. Steam locomotives hauled long trains across mountain passes, through river valleys, and along the densely populated coastal plains. Passenger services allowed students, office workers, merchants, and families to travel between towns, while freight trains transported coal, rice, timber, manufactured goods, and countless other necessities. As wartime mobilization expanded, the railway system became even more important. Military transport received increasing priority. Troops, equipment, fuel, and supplies had to be moved efficiently between ports, factories, and training centers. Civilian passenger services continued, but timetables became less predictable as military trains were given precedence. Travelers learned to expect delays and crowded carriages, particularly on routes serving industrial districts or major ports. Stations remained busy throughout the war. Porters pushed handcarts loaded with luggage, parcels, and mailbags. Station staff directed passengers with whistles and carefully timed signals. Vendors who had once sold a variety of refreshments often found themselves offering fewer products as shortages became more severe. Even so, railway stations continued to serve as familiar meeting places where families welcomed relatives home or said farewell to those leaving for military service or wartime employment. Electric trams remained an important part of daily transport within many cities. Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, Hiroshima, Nagoya, and several other urban centers relied upon tram networks to carry passengers between residential neighborhoods, commercial districts, and factories. During rush hours, the trams became increasingly crowded as more workers traveled to industry supporting the war effort. Buses supplemented the railways, especially in areas without tram lines. However, fuel shortages gradually reduced available services. Routes were adjusted, timetables simplified, and maintenance became more challenging as spare parts grew difficult to obtain. Drivers and mechanics often kept older vehicles operating far longer than originally intended through careful repairs and practical ingenuity. For many people, the bicycle became the most dependable means of transport. Long before the war, bicycles had been common throughout Japan. During the conflict, their importance increased even further. Workers cycled to factories before sunrise. Shopkeepers used bicycles to deliver goods within their neighborhoods. Students rode to school when distances permitted, while doctors, postal employees, and local officials often relied upon bicycles during their daily duties. Because bicycles required no petrol, they remained practical even when fuel supplies became extremely limited. Repair shops therefore played an important role within local communities. Mechanics carefully patched tires, adjusted chains, repaired wheels, and reused worn components whenever possible. New replacement parts were often scarce, making careful maintenance essential. Private motorcars, never common among most households, became even less visible as the war continued. Petrol was reserved primarily for military needs and essential civilian services. Government agencies, emergency vehicles, and certain industries continued operating motor vehicles where necessary, but ordinary families seldom traveled by car. Japan's ports formed another vital part of the national transport system. Major harbors such as Yokohama, Kobe, Osaka, Nagasaki, and Moji connected the home islands with overseas territories and international shipping routes. Before the Pacific War, merchant vessels regularly carried imported oil, iron ore, rubber, cotton, food, and machinery to Japanese ports while exporting manufactured goods, textiles, and other products abroad. As Allied naval forces expanded their operations, maintaining these shipping routes became increasingly difficult. Merchant ships faced growing danger from submarines and aircraft. Convoys attempted to provide protection, but losses steadily increased during 1943 and 1944. Every cargo vessel that failed to reach Japan reduced the supply of essential materials available for factories, transport, agriculture, and daily life. The consequences appeared gradually rather than suddenly. A factory might receive less steel than expected. A machine awaiting repair might remain out of service because replacement parts never arrived. Households noticed fewer imported goods in local shops. Fuel became increasingly scarce. The effect spread quietly through almost every aspect of civilian life. Factories experienced similar changes. During the early years of the war, many industries expanded production rapidly. Shipyards worked to replace naval and merchant vessels. Engineering works manufactured machine tools, engines, and industrial equipment. Steel mills operated at high capacity, while chemical plants produced materials needed for both military and civilian purposes. Industrial cities such as Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama became centers of continuous activity. Factory whistles marked the beginning and end of shifts. Workers arrived carrying lunch boxes and work clothes. Machinery operated for long hours, often late into the evening. Supervisors organized production schedules according to government priorities, while engineers sought ways to use increasingly limited supplies of raw materials more efficiently. The workforce itself changed as the war progressed. With growing numbers of men serving in the armed forces, employers recruited women, older workers, and younger employees to fill essential positions. Many women who had previously devoted most of their time to household responsibilities found themselves employed in factories, offices, transportation, or agricultural work. The nature of this work varied considerably. Some assembled aircraft components. Others produced textiles, uniforms, radios, or mechanical parts. Many worked in food processing, communications, or clerical administration. Although working conditions differed from one factory to another, longer hours became increasingly common as labor shortages intensified. Young people also contributed to wartime production. Older students sometimes participated in organized labor programs that combined education with practical work. Technical schools emphasized engineering and industrial skills considered valuable to the national economy. As the conflict entered its final years, some secondary school pupils spent significant periods assisting factories or farms where additional labor was urgently needed. Agriculture faced its own challenges. Rice cultivation remained essential, and farmers continued following seasonal routines that had changed little over generations. Fields were flooded, seedlings transplanted by hand, irrigation carefully managed, and harvests gathered with patient, physical labor. Yet wartime conditions made farming more demanding. Many younger men had entered military service, leaving greater responsibilities to older relatives, women, and children. Machinery remained limited in much of rural Japan, so successful harvests depended largely upon manual work and cooperation among neighboring families. Agricultural officials encouraged increased production wherever possible. New cultivation methods were promoted through meetings, newspapers, and local organizations. Farmers were asked to maximize available land, reduce waste, and contribute directly to national food security. Fishing communities experienced similar adjustments. Japan's fishing industry had long supplied an important source of protein for the population. Coastal fishermen continued launching their boats whenever weather and fuel permitted. However, restrictions on fuel, changing maritime conditions, and military priorities increasingly affected both the size of catches and their distribution. Even when fish were plentiful locally, transporting them quickly to inland cities became more complicated as railway capacity and refrigeration systems came under growing pressure. Postal services, though less visible than railways or factories, remained remarkably important throughout the war. Letters connected families separated by military service, evacuation, or wartime employment. Mail carriers continued their daily rounds through cities, towns, and villages, delivering official notices alongside personal correspondence. Delays became more common as transportation difficulties increased, yet many households eagerly awaited each delivery, hoping for news from sons, husbands, brothers, or friends serving far from home. Telephones existed primarily in government offices, businesses, and wealthier households. Most communication therefore continued to rely upon letters, telegrams, newspapers, and radio broadcasts. The written letter retained enormous importance, offering reassurance that loved ones remained safe, even if details of military operations were often limited by censorship. As 1944 gave way to 1945, transportation and industry came under increasing strain from repeated air raids. Railway workshops repaired damaged tracks with remarkable speed. Bridge crews restored crossings whenever possible. Factory workers cleared debris before restarting production. Harbor employees unloaded cargo despite damaged docks and frequent interruptions. Ordinary workers demonstrated considerable persistence, often returning to familiar routines soon after disruption whenever circumstances allowed. By the final months of the war, however, accumulated shortages of fuel, raw materials, machinery, and labor made continued production increasingly difficult. Some factories reduced operations because essential supplies could no longer be obtained. Railway services became less reliable. Shipping losses limited imports to a fraction of their pre-war levels. Even under these conditions, daily work continued wherever possible. Farmers still planted rice. Mechanics still repaired locomotives. Teachers continued lessons. Postal workers sorted letters. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Factory whistles still marked the beginning of another shift. The scale of the challenges had grown enormously, but ordinary people continued performing countless small tasks that kept communities functioning for as long as circumstances allowed. These quiet acts of routine rarely appeared in newspaper headlines, yet together they formed the foundation of civilian life throughout the war. They remind us that behind every large historical event stood millions of individuals whose daily work, though seldom celebrated, sustained their families, their neighborhoods, and their country through years of extraordinary uncertainty. Chapter 8: Children, Schools, and Family Life. For children growing up in Japan during the Second World War, daily life was shaped by a mixture of familiar routines and gradual change. School bells still marked the beginning of lessons, parents still reminded children to help with household chores, and neighborhood friendships continued despite the growing demands of wartime life. Yet as the conflict continued, almost every aspect of childhood was influenced in some way by the nation's increasing mobilization. Education had long been regarded as an important responsibility in Japanese society. By the late 1930s, nearly all children attended primary school, where they learned reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history, science, and moral education. Schools also encouraged discipline, cleanliness, punctuality, and respect for teachers. The school day often began with an assembly before pupils walked together into classrooms arranged with neat rows of wooden desks and blackboards. As wartime policies expanded, the curriculum gradually changed. Lessons continued in mathematics and language, but greater emphasis was placed upon physical fitness, national history, and civic responsibility. Teachers encouraged students to understand the importance of cooperation and service to the wider community. Morning exercises became a familiar part of the school day, and organized drills helped prepare pupils for possible emergencies. Many schools displayed maps showing the Japanese Empire, while classrooms often contained portraits of the emperor that were treated with great respect. Ceremonies marking national holidays continued throughout the war, providing moments when students gathered together in orderly formation to listen to speeches or sing patriotic songs. Despite these changes, much of school life remained reassuringly ordinary. Children still copied characters carefully into exercise books. They solved arithmetic problems. They practiced calligraphy with brushes and ink. Teachers corrected homework, praised careful work, and encouraged students who found lessons difficult. Friendships formed during these years often centered on familiar routines rather than world events. Children played together during breaks, shared lunches, exchanged stories, and helped one another with schoolwork much as they had before the war. The journey to school varied according to where a family lived. In cities, many pupils walked through busy streets lined with small shops and tram tracks. Rural children often followed narrow paths between rice fields or crossed small wooden bridges before reaching the village school. Older students sometimes cycled longer distances, particularly in areas where bicycles were available. As air raids became more likely during the later years of the war, schools introduced regular emergency exercises. When warning sirens sounded during practice, teachers calmly directed pupils to follow established procedures. Children learned where shelters were located and how to protect themselves if aircraft approached. These drills became another routine within the school calendar, practiced alongside ordinary lessons rather than replacing them entirely. School lunches reflected the changing food situation. Before shortages became severe, many pupils brought simple meals prepared at home, often packed neatly into bento boxes. As rationing intensified, these lunches became smaller and more dependent upon available ingredients. Rice was frequently mixed with barley or other grains, while vegetables and preserved foods appeared more often than meat or fish. Where schools organized communal meals, menus changed according to local supplies. Teachers encouraged children not to waste food, reminding them that every grain of rice represented valuable work performed by farmers and transport workers. Outside the classroom, children were expected to contribute to family life. In farming communities, they helped transplant rice seedlings, gathered vegetables, fed animals, collected firewood, or assisted with harvesting according to their age and ability. In towns and cities, they might help with shopping, carry water, look after younger brothers and sisters, or deliver small errands for elderly neighbors. These responsibilities were not entirely new, but wartime labor shortages meant that every pair of willing hands became more valuable. Many children also participated in organized collections of recyclable materials. Schools encouraged pupils to gather scrap paper, metal objects, bottles, and other items that could be reused. Competitions between classes sometimes rewarded careful collection efforts, turning practical conservation into a shared activity rather than a burden. Leisure changed more slowly than many other aspects of life. Children continued inventing games with simple toys or everyday objects. Balls made from cloth, skipping ropes, wooden spinning tops, marbles, and homemade toys remained popular. Parks, temple grounds, quiet streets, and open fields provided places where children could run, climb, and play whenever school and household duties allowed. Books also remained important companions. School libraries, where available, offered stories, biographies, and educational works. At home, families often owned only a small number of books, but these were read repeatedly and shared among siblings. Storytelling within the family remained common during evenings, especially when electricity was limited and entertainment options were few. The radio occupied an increasingly important place within many households. Families gathered to hear news bulletins, educational programs, music, and official announcements. Children often listened alongside parents and grandparents, though younger listeners did not always fully understand the international events being described. For them, the familiar sound of the family radio often represented an evening routine rather than a source of political information. Family life itself changed as more men entered military service. Many households experienced the absence of fathers, older brothers, uncles, or cousins serving overseas. Mothers assumed additional responsibilities for managing finances, maintaining the home, and raising children. Grandparents frequently helped care for younger family members, particularly in multi-generational households where several generations lived under one roof. Letters became especially important during these years. When mail arrived from a family member serving abroad, it was often read carefully and sometimes more than once. Although military censorship limited what could be written about operations or locations, even brief messages provided reassurance. A few lines describing good health or pleasant weather could offer considerable comfort to relatives waiting at home. Children sometimes replied with carefully written letters describing school activities, family news, or the changing seasons. Drawings, pressed flowers, or simple greetings occasionally accompanied these messages, creating small but meaningful connections across great distances. Traditional celebrations continued wherever circumstances permitted. The New Year remained the most important holiday for many families. Homes were cleaned before the holiday, simple decorations prepared, and special food served according to what ingredients were available. Even during difficult years, many households tried to preserve these customs, believing that familiar traditions provided stability during uncertain times. Seasonal festivals were often more modest than before the war. Some public celebrations became smaller because resources were limited or because many local men were absent in military service. Nevertheless, neighborhoods continued observing local traditions whenever practical, and religious ceremonies at shrines and temples remained part of community life. Birthdays were usually quiet occasions. Large parties were uncommon, particularly during the later war years, but parents still found ways to recognize important family milestones. A favorite meal, an extra sweet when available, or simply spending the evening together could make the day feel special. For older teenagers, the future became increasingly shaped by national needs. Some entered technical schools or apprenticeships supporting wartime industries. Others prepared for military service as they approached adulthood. Young women often received training that would allow them to contribute to factories, offices, hospitals, or agricultural work. The separation of families became more noticeable during the final years of the conflict. As bombing intensified in 1944 and 1945, many school children from large cities were evacuated to safer rural districts. Some traveled with teachers and classmates, while others stayed with relatives or host families in the countryside. The purpose was to reduce the danger posed by air raids while allowing education to continue under safer conditions. For many children, this evacuation represented their first extended period away from home. Country life differed greatly from the crowded streets of Tokyo, Osaka, or Yokohama. Rural communities followed agricultural rhythms, with early mornings, seasonal farm work, and quieter evenings. Although homesickness was common, many host families welcomed evacuated children warmly, helping them adjust to unfamiliar surroundings. Parents remaining in the cities often worried constantly about their children's welfare, just as children wondered how their families were managing at home. Letters traveled back and forth whenever postal services allowed, becoming treasured reminders of family life despite the physical distance between them. By the final months of the war, ordinary routines had become increasingly difficult to maintain. Air raids interrupted lessons, damaged schools, and displaced many families. Yet teachers continued organizing classes wherever buildings remained usable. Lessons sometimes took place in temporary facilities, community halls, or other available spaces, reflecting a determination to preserve education even under challenging conditions. Looking back, the wartime childhood of Japanese boys and girls was neither entirely defined by conflict nor untouched by it. There were still friendships, lessons, family meals, games, and seasonal celebrations. There were still schoolbooks to carry, gardens to tend, and chores to complete before supper. At the same time, there were ration books, air raid drills, absent family members, and an increasing awareness that the world beyond the neighborhood was changing rapidly. For many children, these two realities existed side by side. The ordinary rhythms of growing up continued, even as the war gradually reshaped the society around them. Chapter 9: Society under wartime pressure. As the war continued, the pressures experienced by Japanese society extended far beyond the battlefield. They appeared in workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, and homes, often through small changes that accumulated over time. New regulations, shortages, and responsibilities gradually reshaped the way communities functioned. Although these developments differed from one region to another, many families found that everyday life became increasingly organized around the needs of a nation at war. One of the most noticeable features of wartime society was the growing role of the state in daily affairs. Government ministries issued regulations covering production, transportation, food distribution, labor, education, and public information. These policies were usually carried out by prefectural authorities, municipal governments, and neighborhood organizations, creating a network that connected national decisions with local communities. For many citizens, these changes did not feel dramatic from one week to the next. Instead, they appeared as a steady increase in forms to complete, meetings to attend, instructions to follow, and responsibilities to share. A notice posted outside the local government office, a new timetable at school, or a revised ration allowance at the neighborhood shop all reflected decisions made far beyond the immediate community. Information was also carefully managed. Newspapers remained an important source of daily news, but wartime censorship became increasingly strict. Editors worked within government guidelines, and reports about military operations were reviewed before publication. Radio broadcasts followed similar rules, presenting official announcements, reports from the front, weather forecasts, educational programs, and music selected for public broadcast. Most people therefore understood the progress of the war through information that had already been carefully filtered. As the military situation became more difficult after 1942, reports increasingly emphasized courage, perseverance, and national unity rather than detailed accounts of setbacks. Major defeats were sometimes reported only briefly or long after they had occurred. For ordinary listeners, the gradual worsening of the war often became more apparent through shortages and changing daily conditions than through official news. Neighborhood associations continued to play an important role throughout these years. Members organized air raid preparations, distributed ration information, and helped ensure that local regulations were understood. They also coordinated practical assistance for elderly residents, organized community cleanup efforts, and checked firefighting equipment. These organizations reflected both cooperation and obligation. Many neighbors appreciated the practical support they provided during difficult times. At the same time, participation was generally expected, and attendance at meetings or community activities formed part of ordinary civic life. In this way, wartime society encouraged collective responsibility while leaving relatively little room for individual independence. Civil defense became increasingly familiar as Allied air attacks grew more frequent. Volunteers trained in firefighting, first aid, and emergency response. Water buckets, Sand containers, ladders, and simple hand tools were stored at convenient locations throughout residential districts. Families learned where local shelters were situated and practiced moving quickly when warning sirens sounded. Blackout regulations also required careful attention. After sunset, windows were covered with curtains, boards, or specially prepared materials designed to prevent light from escaping. Street lighting was reduced wherever possible. Even a small amount of visible light might attract unwanted attention during an air raid, so neighborhoods worked together to ensure that regulations were followed consistently. Religious institutions continued serving their communities despite wartime conditions. Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples remained places where people gathered for prayer, seasonal ceremonies, funerals, and local festivals whenever circumstances permitted. Clergy often found themselves offering comfort to families whose relatives were serving overseas or who had experienced loss through bombing or displacement. Many temples also provided practical assistance. Some sheltered evacuees, stored community supplies, or opened their buildings for temporary meetings when schools or public halls became unavailable. Their role reflected a long tradition of serving both spiritual and practical needs within local communities. Women carried an increasing share of responsibility as the war progressed. With many men absent in military service, wives, mothers, daughters, and sisters managed households while also contributing to the wider economy. Some worked in factories or offices, others remained in agriculture, while many combined paid employment with domestic responsibilities. The balance between these duties was rarely easy. A woman might spend the morning working in a factory, return home to prepare a modest evening meal, mend worn clothing, supervise children's homework, and plan the following day's shopping according to whatever ration supplies might become available. Despite these demands, community support often remained strong. Neighbors exchanged practical advice. Families shared gardening techniques. Experienced cooks suggested ways to prepare meals from limited ingredients. When a household experienced illness or hardship, nearby residents sometimes offered assistance through meals, childcare, or simple acts of kindness. Not every experience of wartime society, however, reflected cooperation alone. Political dissent became increasingly difficult. The government expected public support for national policy, and organizations responsible for public order paid close attention to activities considered threatening to national security. Newspapers, books, public meetings, and many forms of communication operated within clearly defined limits. For most ordinary people, daily life remained focused on practical concerns rather than politics. Finding enough food, completing work, caring for children, repairing clothing, waiting for letters, preparing for possible air raids. These immediate responsibilities left little time for wider political discussion. As the conflict continued, increasing numbers of people from territories under Japanese control were brought to the empire to perform labor in mines, factories, construction projects, and other industries. Their experiences varied greatly depending on location, occupation, and circumstances, but many endured harsh conditions and had little freedom over where they lived or worked. This formed one of the more difficult aspects of Japan's wartime economy and reflected the broader human cost of the conflict beyond the home islands. Within Japan itself, labor shortages also encouraged the wider use of student workers and additional mobilization of civilian employees. Schools adjusted schedules, universities modified courses, and many institutions balanced education with practical work considered important to the national effort. The growing pressure became especially visible after large-scale bombing began in 1945. Entire neighborhoods organized teams to clear debris from damaged streets. Residents searched for usable building materials. Temporary shelters appeared where homes had been destroyed. Local governments attempted to restore water supplies, electricity, and transport as quickly as circumstances allowed. Even under these conditions, familiar routines often returned surprisingly quickly. A shopkeeper swept dust from the entrance before opening for business. Teachers gathered children for lessons in an undamaged building nearby. Railway workers repaired tracks through the night so that trains could resume service the following morning. These quiet efforts rarely attracted public attention, yet they demonstrated the determination of ordinary communities to preserve everyday life despite extraordinary circumstances. Throughout the war, Japanese society experienced constant tension between continuity and change. Long-established customs remained important. Families still removed their shoes before entering the home. Tea was still served to visitors whenever possible. Seasonal festivals continued in reduced form. Children still bowed respectfully to teachers. At the same time, ration books, blackout curtains, evacuation plans, air raid drills, and official regulations became equally familiar parts of daily existence. By the summer of 1945, the cumulative weight of these pressures could be felt almost everywhere. Years of shortages had reduced household supplies. Repeated bombing had transformed many cities. Families remained separated by military service, evacuation, or wartime employment. Yet within homes across the country, ordinary life continued wherever circumstances allowed. Meals were prepared. Laundry was washed and hung to dry. Gardens were tended. Children studied. Letters were written. These simple activities, repeated quietly from one day to the next, reflected a society striving to preserve a sense of normality even as the conflict approached its final stage. Chapter 10: The Final Phase of the War. By the beginning of 1945, it had become increasingly clear that Japan faced circumstances very different from those of the war's opening years. The rapid advances of 1941 and 1942 had long since given way to a defensive struggle. Allied forces controlled much of the Pacific, maritime supply routes had been severely disrupted, and the home islands were experiencing regular air attacks. For ordinary civilians, these broad military developments were reflected in practical changes that touched nearly every aspect of daily life. Food grew scarcer. Transportation became less reliable. Factories struggled to obtain raw materials. Families waited anxiously for news that often arrived only after long delays. Many people continued to carry out their routines with remarkable determination, but there was little doubt that the pressures of war had reached their greatest intensity. Throughout the spring and summer of 1945, American B-29 bombers conducted repeated raids against cities across Japan. Industrial districts remained important targets, yet residential neighborhoods were also heavily affected because factories, workshops, and homes often stood close together. The destruction varied from city to city. Some communities experienced only occasional attacks. Others suffered repeated raids that altered entire districts within a matter of hours. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, and many smaller cities all experienced significant damage during these final months. For families living in threatened areas, daily routines increasingly revolved around preparation. Important documents were kept together. A few changes of clothing might be packed into a small bundle. Water buckets remained filled. Neighbors knew which elderly residents might need assistance if an alarm sounded during the night. Children who had already been evacuated to rural areas often remained there, while parents continued working in the cities whenever possible. This separation, though intended to improve safety, placed emotional strain on many families. Letters became even more precious, offering reassurance across the growing distance between parents and children. The railway system continued operating despite repeated interruptions. Repair crews worked quickly after bombing raids to restore damaged lines, replace signals, and clear debris. Passengers often traveled through landscapes that bore visible signs of recent destruction before arriving in stations where everyday activity continued as normally as circumstances allowed. Markets also remained open wherever supplies could be obtained. Shopkeepers arranged modest displays using whatever goods had arrived. customers accepted that familiar items might simply not be available. Rather than expressing surprise, many quietly adapted, purchasing alternatives or returning another day in the hope that deliveries would improve. In the countryside, farmers continued planting and harvesting according to the seasons. Rice fields still required careful irrigation. Vegetable gardens still demanded regular attention. Livestock still needed feeding each morning. Although shortages of labor, fertilizer, and equipment created additional difficulties, the rhythm of agricultural work continued with remarkable consistency. For many rural communities, maintaining food production had become one of the most important contributions they could make during the final months of the war. As summer approached, military operations moved steadily closer to Japan itself. The Battle of Okinawa, fought between April and June 1945, brought devastating destruction to the islands far south of the Japanese mainland. Civilians suffered greatly during the fighting, and the battle demonstrated how destructive a campaign on Japanese territory could become. News reaching the home islands remained limited, yet many people understood that the conflict was approaching its final stage. During July, Allied air attacks continued almost daily against various parts of Japan. Naval bombardments also struck selected industrial areas along the coast. Factories attempted to continue production whenever possible, but many had already dispersed machinery into smaller workshops or rural locations in an effort to reduce the effects of bombing. Despite these preparations, production declined steadily. Fuel remained critically short. Electric power was sometimes interrupted. Transportation delays became increasingly common. Many workers simply did whatever tasks remained possible using the materials available. Then came August. On the morning of the 6th of August, 1945, a single American aircraft dropped an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. The weapon caused destruction on a scale unlike anything previously experienced. Much of the city was devastated within moments. 3 days later, on the 9th of August, a second atomic bomb was dropped over Nagasaki, causing similarly catastrophic destruction. For people elsewhere in Japan, information about these events arrived gradually. Initial reports were incomplete. Communication lines had been damaged. Officials themselves required time to understand the nature of the new weapon. Ordinary citizens often learned only that an entire city had suffered extraordinary destruction. These bombings occurred alongside other major developments. On the 8th of August, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched military operations in Manchuria. This added another profound challenge to an already desperate situation and further reduced hopes that the conflict could continue. Within the Japanese government, discussions intensified. Military leaders, government ministers, and senior officials considered the country's rapidly deteriorating position. The shortages affecting civilians, the destruction of cities, the collapse of shipping, the atomic bombings, and the Soviet entry into the war all contributed to an increasingly urgent search for a conclusion. On the 15th of August, 1945, the Japanese people heard something few had ever expected. For the first time, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation directly by radio. The recording, broadcast throughout the country, announced Japan's acceptance of the terms laid out in the Potsdam Declaration and the decision to end the war. Many listeners found the formal language difficult to understand immediately. Some gathered quietly around radios in homes, schools, workplaces, or government offices. Others stood silently in streets or village squares after hearing the announcement repeated and explained. For countless families, the first feeling was not celebration but quiet reflection. After years of war, uncertainty remained. Many wondered what would happen next. Would soldiers return home? Would food supplies improve? How would daily life change? The formal surrender documents were signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September, 1945, bringing the Second World War officially to an end. Soon afterward, Allied occupation forces, led primarily by the United States under General Douglas MacArthur, began administering Japan. For civilians, the occupation introduced another period of adjustment rather than an immediate return to normal life. Government institutions continued operating but under new supervision. Military organizations were gradually dissolved. Weapons were collected. Former soldiers returned home in large numbers over many months, often after long journeys from distant parts of Asia and the Pacific. Some returned to families who had waited years for news. Others came home to neighborhoods transformed by bombing or to homes that no longer stood. Prisoners of war and civilian internees also began returning from overseas, although the process extended well beyond 1945. Housing shortages became one of the country's most immediate concerns. Entire districts required rebuilding. Families sometimes shared accommodation with relatives while repairs were undertaken. Schools, temples, community halls, and other public buildings occasionally served temporary purposes until permanent housing could be arranged. Food remained scarce even after the fighting had ended. The end of military operations did not immediately restore harvests, transportation, or international trade. During the months that followed, many communities continued relying upon careful rationing while new supply systems were established. Assistance from abroad, together with improving harvests, gradually eased some of the most severe shortages, though recovery required time. Political life also entered a period of significant change. Under the Allied occupation, reforms were introduced affecting government, education, industry, labor relations, and the legal system. New elections were held, political parties re-emerged, and public discussion gradually became more open than it had been during the war years. For ordinary people, however, these national reforms were often experienced through practical changes rather than constitutional debates. Children returned to classrooms. Factories shifted from military production toward civilian goods. Railway services slowly became more dependable. Markets gradually offered a wider variety of products. Families reunited whenever circumstances allowed. The process was neither quick nor simple. The war had lasted many years. Its effects could not disappear within a single season. Yet by the closing months of 1945, a different rhythm had begun to emerge. The sound of air raid sirens became less frequent, then disappeared altogether. Blackout curtains were no longer needed. The careful routines of wartime emergency slowly gave way to the equally patient work of rebuilding homes, restoring communities, and creating a peaceful future from the difficult experiences of the years that had passed. Chapter 11, Peaceful Epilogue, An Ordinary Day After the War. As the first years of peace settled across Japan, the country did not awaken to a single moment of complete recovery. Instead, normal life returned gradually, carried forward by countless ordinary routines that had survived even the most difficult years. The rebuilding of cities, homes, and industries would take many years, but the rebuilding of daily habits began almost immediately. On an early autumn morning, the streets of a neighborhood in Tokyo begin to stir before sunrise. The air is cool, carrying the scent of damp earth after the night's dew. A bicycle rolls quietly along a narrow street as a newspaper delivery worker makes the first rounds of the day. The city bears visible signs of recent hardship. Empty spaces remain where buildings once stood, while nearby, carpenters and laborers are already preparing timber for new homes and shops. Yet alongside these reminders of the past, ordinary life is steadily returning. Kitchen fires are lit one by one. Rice begins to steam in simple pots. Miso soup warms gently over charcoal or small stoves. The morning meal remains modest, but families gather together before the day's work begins. Parents discuss practical matters, shopping, repairs, school schedules, or letters expected from relatives who have not yet returned home. Children quietly finish breakfast before collecting their school bags. The streets gradually become busier. Office workers walk toward railway stations carrying briefcases that have often been carefully repaired rather than replaced. Shopkeepers slide open wooden doors and sweep the pavement outside their businesses before arranging goods in neat displays. Some shelves remain sparsely stocked, but each passing month brings small improvements. Fresh vegetables appear more regularly, and customers once again have choices that had long disappeared during the war. At the local bakery, warm bread is placed carefully in the front window. Not every family buys bread each morning, but its familiar smell drifting into the street is another quiet sign that ordinary commerce has resumed. Nearby, a tofu maker prepares the day's first batches while customers arrive carrying small containers from home. Railway stations once again become places of routine rather than uncertainty. Steam locomotives pull into the platforms with their familiar rhythm of hissing valves and clouds of white vapor. Conductors call destinations clearly. Porters push luggage carts through waiting passengers. Students in neat uniforms stand alongside office workers, factory employees, nurses, and farmers traveling into town. The station clock marks the passing minutes just as it did before the war, reminding everyone that the day follows a dependable rhythm once more. In schools across the country, classrooms gradually fill with conversation before lessons begin. Children remove their shoes, place books neatly upon their desks, and greet their teachers. Some classrooms occupy newly repaired buildings, while others continue using temporary facilities as reconstruction progresses. Despite these differences, the sounds are reassuringly familiar: chalk against a blackboard, pages turning, pencils scratching across paper, and quiet voices reading aloud. Lessons once interrupted by air raid alarms now proceed without interruption. Arithmetic problems are solved. Stories are read. Maps are unfolded. Science experiments return to classrooms where equipment is available. Playgrounds echo with games during morning breaks, and friendships grow naturally among children who know little of the political decisions that shaped the years before they were born. Beyond the towns and cities, the countryside follows its own steady pace. Farmers walk narrow paths between rice fields that shimmer beneath the morning sun. Water reflects the sky as dragonflies drift above the paddies. The harvest approaches, and neighbors help one another prepare tools, repair storage buildings, and organize the work that lies ahead. The seasons continue as they always have. Spring planting, summer growth, autumn harvest, winter preparation. These rhythms remained constant throughout the war, and they now provide a reassuring sense of continuity for communities looking toward the future. Fishing boats leave small harbors before dawn. Crews untie mooring ropes, start modest engines, or raise sails where necessary, guiding their vessels toward familiar fishing grounds. By midday, the day's catch begins arriving at local markets where buyers inspect baskets of fish before they are distributed to shops and restaurants. Market squares gradually regain their lively atmosphere. Vegetable stalls display cabbages, daikon radishes, onions, sweet potatoes, and leafy greens arranged with quiet care. Customers greet shopkeepers by name, exchanging brief conversations about the weather, family news, or the quality of the latest harvest. These ordinary exchanges, so common before the war, once again become part of daily life. Postmen continue their rounds through neighborhoods carrying leather mailbags worn smooth by years of service. Letters still hold great importance. Some bring news from relatives rebuilding lives in distant prefectures. Others contain photographs, invitations, or simple greetings. Each envelope represents another thread reconnecting families and friends after years of separation. Throughout the afternoon, workshops echo with familiar sounds. A carpenter planes fresh timber. A blacksmith shapes metal with measured blows. A tailor repairs jackets whose careful stitching allows them to serve for several more seasons. Mechanics adjust bicycle chains while customers wait patiently outside the shop. Many businesses remain small, often operated by families working together, but each contributes quietly to the wider recovery of the country. Religious life also resumes its familiar rhythm. Temple bells ring softly across towns and villages. Visitors pause briefly at Shinto shrines before continuing to work or school. Seasonal festivals begin returning to local calendars. Lanterns once again appear along quiet streets during celebrations. Music, traditional dances, and food stalls bring neighbors together, not to forget the past, but to continue the customs that have long connected one generation to the next. As evening approaches, commuters return home. Steam trains arrive with a gentle hiss. Bicycles roll through residential streets. Children finish homework while parents prepare supper using ingredients gathered during the day's shopping. The meal remains simple, often centered on rice, soup, vegetables, and fish when available, but it is shared around the family table without the constant uncertainty that had marked the closing years of the war. Laundry hangs outside many homes, moving gently in the evening breeze. Gardens are watered. Neighbors exchange quiet greetings over garden fences. Cats wander narrow lanes in search of comfortable places to rest before nightfall. Gradually, lights begin appearing in windows across the neighborhood. There is no longer any need to cover them with blackout curtains. Warm yellow light shines freely onto quiet streets where people take short evening walks before returning indoors. The sound of distant conversation drifts through open windows, accompanied by the occasional whistle of a train or the ringing of a bicycle bell. Inside the home, the day comes gently to its close. Children prepare school bags for tomorrow. Parents read the evening newspaper or mend clothing that still has many years of use ahead. A kettle quietly warms water for tea. The familiar routines of washing dishes, folding bedding, closing shutters, and checking the weather for the following day unfold without hurry. There is comfort in repetition. The same railway will depart in the morning. The same baker will open before sunrise. The same farmers will walk into their fields. The same teachers will welcome another class of children. History often remembers wars through great battles, political leaders, and important decisions. Yet for most people, life has always been measured differently. It is measured in shared meals, letters received, trains caught on time, gardens carefully tended, children growing older, neighbors offering help, and evenings spent quietly at home. Japan emerged from the Second World War profoundly changed. Cities required rebuilding, families carried memories of loss, and the work of recovery would continue for many years. But alongside these immense national tasks came millions of small, ordinary acts that gradually restored the rhythm of peaceful life. A shopkeeper unlocking the front door. A school bell ringing at the start of the day. A gardener trimming a hedge. A fisherman mending his nets. A mother setting bowls upon the table. A child hurrying home before sunset. These simple moments rarely appear in history books, yet together they tell another part of the story. They remind us that after years of uncertainty, ordinary life slowly returned, not all at once, but one morning, one meal, one journey, and one quiet evening at a time. And as the lamps glow softly behind familiar windows, as the last train disappears into the distance, and as the sounds of the neighborhood gradually settle into silence, the country prepares for another peaceful night, ready to greet another ordinary day with quiet determination.